Welcome to the UK, Dr. P.
Hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you from the same time zone.
I know, what a luxury. This is the first time since Christmas.
Yeah.
And you've got a woolly hat on in May.
I'm used to it being 32 degrees.
Oh.
It's about 32 degrees Fahrenheit.
This is The Method, a podcast from Thriver about what health looks like in the real world.
I'm Dr. Greg Potter. I'm a scientist and health and performance consultant.
And I'm Charlie Edmondson. Whilst I love sports, I'm definitely not a science expert. I've got a regular job and I'm here to remind Greg of what life's actually like when you're not a nerd.
You must be a nerd about something, I bet you are. On this show, we'll work out some sustainable changes to your routine that are actually going to make a difference to your health. And to do that, we have a simple 3-step method. With the help of an expert, we first unpack the science behind one key health question. Second, we give some recommendations related to what we're speaking about on the day. And then finally, we put the practice to the test.
Each week, we're going to hear from those who have tried and tested our recommendations to help turn a so-called ideal lifestyle into something that actually works for you. Today, we're talking with David Allison, who is one of the world's leading obesity researchers and biostatisticians. Why I put biostatistician in my intro, thinking I was going to just roll that off my tongue. And someone who spent decades studying this space and challenging a lot of assumptions within it. He is currently a professor of paediatrics and director of the USDA Children's Nutrition Research Center and has published extensively on nutrition, body weight, and health. We are getting into the science of obesity, from how it's defined to what actually drives it and how we can think about prevention and treatment in a way that's realistic and evidence-based.
I want to be very, very quick to add that this is a sensitive subject and it's hugely consequential, and we want to be considerate when we speak about it. And so if we say things like obese people as opposed to people with obesity, which is what we should say, then we apologize in advance. And it's also going to become clear that there's a lot of disagreement about how to best define what obesity is. However, I think there's converging evidence regarding how to best prevent it and treat it. And nowadays we have effective treatments, whereas historically we really struggled to find safe and effective treatments. And while we're focusing on obesity today, what we're speaking about really is body composition. So how much of your body is made up of fat-free mass, which includes things like muscle and bone, and fat mass. And for most of us, our body composition fluctuates over time. So even if you're not someone who right now struggles with their body weight and you're not necessarily trying to lose fat at the moment, we think this episode is still very relevant to you. And it can be helpful to understand some of the different drivers of things like weight gain, because there might come a time when this is more relevant to you later in life if your circumstances change. There's been huge progress in recent years, and David Allison has been a pioneer in this field. So it's an honor to speak with him today.
Oh, well, I'm excited to meet David then. So welcome, David. Lovely to meet you. I was just wondering, to start us off, could you talk us through how you got into this area of research and what led you to focus on obesity?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here and very much looking forward to our discussion. So as a youth, growing up in the world at the time I did, there was lots of people interested in weight and food and diet. And I knew lots of people, including in my family, who struggled with their weight. And it was intrinsically interesting. When I got to college, I took a course called Human Emotion and Motivation. And that course used the work of Stanley Schachter, who was a very prominent psychologist at the time. Just loved his experiments. And I realized that not only could you address obesity from many angles, genetic, economic, physiologic, psychological, etc., but that in fact, if you didn't do it, you didn't have the full picture. And I was at Vassar College, where there was a great emphasis on writing, not so much on, taking standardized tests. So I had to write paper after paper after paper in different courses. I could write a paper on the physiology of obesity. And then I could write a paper on genetics of obesity in a different course, and then developmental aspects in a different course. And so I just stuck with it and I loved it. And then over time, it just built. I've sort of got two admittedly highly intersecting scholarly lives, but one is obesity, energetics, exercise, nutrition. And the other is methods, rigor, reproducibility, statistical analysis, statistical methods. And when I'm at a cocktail party and feeling shy and I don't want to talk to somebody and they ask me what I do, I say I'm a statistician. And that usually makes them go away. But if I do want to talk to people, then I say I'm an obesity researcher. And then the floodgates just open. Everybody's interested.
I'm not sure you'll be able to use that one, though, at dinner parties now moving forwards, because you've just announced that's your tactic.
I think the way that you became interested in obesity is evident now in the breadth of your interest, but we're going to focus now on the science of obesity. And some people might be surprised to hear that while there is a common way to define obesity, that definition is not without its critics. So to kick us off, David, how do you think that we should define obesity for people listening?
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind two different types of definitions of obesity. One of the things that I think we get into many vigorous and unproductive debates in life is when we're not clear about what we're talking about. And so we start to argue past each other because we're not talking about the same thing. There's something called a conceptual definition. Conceptual definition is, what is this thing really? What is it I'm trying to get at? And in obesity, the conceptual definition is relatively straightforward at the broadest level, but how we actually implement it is not so clear. The conceptual definition of obesity is having a level or amount or distribution of body fat that is excessive, where excessive means sufficient to impair health or longevity. Inherent in that are many things. One is it's about body fat. The second is it's about body fat that's too much. And the third is too much for what? Well, for health and longevity. But that's not how it's often implemented. You might take a person who has a great deal of body fat and say, they look healthy right now. You might say, okay, yes, they look healthy now, David, but let's be honest, let's project 20 years from now. They're not going to be so healthy then. Or you might say, yes, they're healthy now, Dave, but they'd be even healthier today if they had less body fat. And so we have some interesting intellectual challenges there, but the conceptual thing is straightforward. Then we get into the operational thing. The operational definition is, how in reality today am I going to define it for practical use? And that's where I think people often get particularly vociferous unnecessarily. The most common measure we use is called body mass index. We use that today, and people are quick to point out, every few years this crops up in a journalistic article. Guess what? BMI is a measure of weight over height. It doesn't actually measure body fat. And an NBA basketball player could come out as having a high BMI, as though this is some great revelation that we haven't thought of. Like, we've been studying this stuff for, 40 years, some of us, and we never figured that out. Give us a little credit. So we're all very well aware of that. There's no mystery there. It is true that it's a measure of weight and not body composition. It turns out, though, that depending on what you want to use it for, it works very well. If you're the World Health Organization and you want to count what proportion of people in different countries are obese, it may not be so bad. You may say, well, out of those 1,000 people you measured, and you categorize some in your data file as obese, some of them really weren't because they were kind of lean. They were like NBA basketball players. And some that you said were not obese kind of were because they were very fatty, even though they had low BMI. It's like, oh, okay. We call that measurement error. And as long as we know it, we can take that into account in interpretation of our results. And BMI works reasonably well for that. On the other hand, so if you are a physician and you treat NBA basketball players and they come to you and you use BMI to decide whether they're obese or not, and you should put them on weight loss medications, you're an idiot. Don't do that. All right. And it's a very bad measure for that context. Now, then you do get into the question you raised about what about different groups? And that's where you get into the idea of cut points. Do you want to cut off to just say this person appears to be obese? Do you want to cut off to say, I should give this person treatment? Some people go with stigma. Oh, hey, you shouldn't say it because it stigmatizes people. Well, again, yes, we want to protect people from stigma. So let's work on that. But that doesn't mean we don't speak the truth. Let us talk rationally. And then we apply cut points where they're needed. Maybe one cut point for an epidemiologist to count, and a different cut point for an adult to get treatment, and a different cut point for an insurance provider to cover it. And these are all different questions. As we go to different populations, the cut points may differ. So you might say, hey, if you're a 50-year-old European ancestry man, maybe this is the right cut point for you. If you're a 20-year-old Southeast Asian woman, maybe that's the right cut point for you. And that information is still evolving.
So we often hear that obesity is linked to a higher risk of different health issues, but they're usually talked about quite generally. Could you break down some of the main risks and what's actually driving those links?
Sure. And I'm glad you used that word linked to. It's one of my least favorite words in epidemiology. And so it gives me a chance to address it, which is, as a statistician and a scientist, I know what the word cause means. So if you say A causes B, I get that. I know what the word associated or correlated means. If you say A is correlated or associated with B, I get that. And then I hear people say linked to, implicated in. What does that mean? And what I think it means is they know it's not really been clearly shown to be associated or causal, and these wiggle words to imply something that hasn't been shown. So we can talk about what's associated, and we can talk about what's known to be to a reasonable degree of certainty. There's no absolute certainty. What we think is known to a reasonable degree of certainty, obesity is related to and causal of an increased mortality rate, shorter lifespan. So all other things being equal, and that's an important phrase, all other things being equal, obese people will live a little less long than non-obese people. Important to realize, I said a little less long. The relative risk for mortality rate with obesity versus non-obesity is not that high. It counts for a couple of years of life. And even at relatively high levels, it's maybe about 5 years. Sometimes it's not even that high. If you think about the difference in lifespan between men and women, it's about 5 years. Sometimes we hear about many people in our communities. He was a ticking time bomb. Look at certainly his BMI, but also he was a heavy smoker and so on. The obesity alone, not really. I think most of us would say that's a little bit of exaggeration. Now, if you're a heavy smoker and you have lots of other things, maybe. So it has an effect, but the effect is not huge. It's nowhere near like smoking, for example. In terms of other things, it's very, very clear that obesity is related to, and we believe causal of, increased risk of hypertension, high blood pressure, increased risk of diabetes, increased risk of some joint problems, and at enough levels, you get some inflammation and strain on joints. So obesity does cause inflammation. It alters the architecture of the bone. It also just mechanically, you've got different things. So there are many, many ways in which obesity affects us. More of them seem to be adverse than protective. And it ranges from, as I said, from mortality to diabetes to hypertension.
In a previous Q&A episode, I explained that whether a person gains or loses fat over time depends on fat balance. The difference between the amount of fat that they're knitting together and the amount of fat that they're burning. And that in turn is quite strongly related to energy balance, the difference between the number of digestible calories they consume and how many they burn. Related to that, nutrition clearly is a strong driver of whether someone is gaining weight, stable, or losing weight over time. So can you give some examples of how diet composition, specifically what a person eats, influences energy balance and propensity to obesity?
Sure. So energy balance matters in terms of energy in, energy out, in terms of change in body energy stores. But that doesn't determine the body fatness per se. Body fatness can be influenced by other things, even conditional upon the total energy in and out. And that includes, but is not limited to, resistance training, hormones, individual genetic effects, and diet composition. I don't think that the effects of diet composition are huge, meaning if you said, where are the things that, have the big influence? I would say it's, well, how much energy one eats relative to what one expends, how much resistance training you do, a little bit about genetics, so on. But above and beyond that, the diet composition can have effects. And there, all other things being equal, higher protein will lead to more lean body mass and less body fat. But again, I'm not saying that that's the big determinant. That is an influence. There are other things that may be influential. Maybe the amount of fat or carbohydrate for the remaining calories matters. There, I think you start to get into some arguments, right? So Kevin Hall might say he believes the data says lower dietary fat, conditional upon all those other things I mentioned, right? Same number of calories. Lower body fat, lower dietary fat leads to lower body fat. David Ludwig might say the opposite. But I don't think at that point we're talking about the really big factors. The really big factors are total energy in and out, age, genetics, resistance training, protein content.
And when I said diet composition, I was really also getting at the number of calories that someone consumes and how that interacts with what they consume.
I have questions for you. I'm going to pick your science brain. Is there a measure or is there a way? Because this whole 2,000 for women, 2,500 for men is so generic when you look at activity levels, size, just general lifestyle. Is there a way that I can accurately go and find out what my level should be?
There are accurate ways, but they involve relatively expensive testing.
Oh.
So there is a gold standard way of assessing your metabolic rate, but then that is going to fluctuate because your total daily energy expenditure, the number of calories you burn each day, is composed of several components, one of which is your resting metabolic rate, but then you also have your physical activity, energy expenditure, and so on. And so the number of calories you burn is dynamic. If my body weight is neither increasing nor decreasing, and I know roughly how many calories I consume because I track that, maybe using an app, then that's probably an approximation of how many calories you burn. And you plug in what your target body weight is, how many weeks you want to take to realize that. And then the app will come up with a plan for you, and it will suggest a combination of macronutrients for you to consume. It won't give you alcohol recommendations though.
Really?
I don't know if there's an app for you, Charlie, where you can specify your Guinness consumption.
It's strange that we don't factor that in. Thank you.
And then, David, before we move on to the practice section where we focus on some changes that listeners can implement to try and alter their body weight in a direction they wish, a lot of people struggle with their weight fluctuating a lot. And many have been through years of yo-yo dieting. Can you explain why some people might find it tricky to maintain their weight loss after dieting?
Sure. Well, as you said, a very common observation is that for those who at some point get to a weight that's higher than they wish, if they're able to bring it down, and many people are, at least partially, it's hard to keep it down. And a very large proportion of people who do bring it down, eventually it comes back up. We can show similar kinds of things in animal models. So for example, if I take some mice and I make them obese and then we restrict their calories and they lose weight because they have no choice, right? We don't let them eat enough. And then we stop restricting their calories and we let them eat as much as they want. They quickly regain the weight. This is very common. We're not the first people to show it. Now, why? Well, one thing is just the simple thing of a system returns to equilibrium if all the forces are the same. If you temporarily perturb those forces and then you let them come back, the system comes back to its prior equilibrium state. So think about a sink. You're pouring water into the sink. You've got a drain in the sink. The water's coming in faster than it can go out the drain. The sink starts to fill up. But then the pressure of the water weight on the drain goes up and the water starts to come out the drain faster. It's like energy expenditure, okay? And eventually you reach an equilibrium and then the sink hopefully hasn't overflowed yet, then it stops at that point, stays stable at that level. Now, if you turn down the faucet a little bit, so the input is lower, that level will go down a little bit. But if you then turn it back up, it goes up again. And that's called a settling point. It settles at a different point. Now, there can also be something adaptive. Let's think about a room with temperature. I put a thermostat on it, and I've got a heater. And the heater is adjusted by the thermostat, which is reading the temperature in the room. Now, we've got an open window. And then it may adapt faster because it doesn't just keep the thermostat or the window at a constant level. It may adjust the window level or heat production at a certain point. That's called the set point, right? Set point, settling point. And then we've got this idea of how might that set point be functioning? What might be these adaptations, right? You could open the window more or less, you could turn the heat up more or less. Well, in the body, the equivalent to turning the heat down is decreasing energy expenditure. Or really maybe a better way to say it's the equivalent of closing the window a little bit, right? You're not letting so much energy get out.
Sorry for the interlude, but give us a moment to talk about Thriver, the company behind this podcast. Charlie, take it away.
Oh, no pressure. So, what we do on The Method is try and help you play the long game with health. You know, the whole longevity thing.
It's very scientific of you.
I'm trying, Greg, I'm trying. And, well, basically, Thriver is built to help you on that journey to long-term health too. They offer tests you can do at home and give you a picture of your blood markers. The goal is to see where you're starting from, make changes, and retest a few months after.
They also have a comprehensive app. You can sync your wearable devices like smartwatch or smart ring, information about your health, such as your goals, your exercise habits, how you eat, and collate all of that in one place. And this way, over time, you can see relationships between things, identify what's actually working.
It's a really simple tool to turn good resolutions into habits that really stick. So check them out at thriver.co, links in the show notes below.
Sweet. Now back to today's episode.
So moving now into the practice section of today's episode, let's get into what this looks like for real life for people, whether that's losing weight or maintaining weight loss.
So you mentioned protein and the fact that we have an appetite for protein. We'll probably carry on eating food until we hit a sufficient amount of protein. That seems to be the case based on some work by a guy named Stephen Simpson. Mm-hmm. And I read your protein paper you recently published, which I thought was terrific, by the way. But what are just a couple of other examples of how what someone eats might affect energy balance?
There are many ways. We have a salt appetite. And so if we don't get enough salt, we'll try to eat more. But salt can also affect things. So salt can make you thirsty. And then if you're drinking things that have calories in them, that may drive greater intake. The palatability of things may matter. And we're still trying to understand that. It's difficult to do very long-term studies and really pin down the hypotheses. So at one eating episode, you might find that something judged to be really palatable is eaten more. It gets a little circular because, well, how did you know it was really palatable? Well, because they ate more. And so it's not clear that we're really adding that much new insight there, but there is some. We also don't know, would that hold up over the long haul? That is, I think if you gave me some wonderful, of my favorite high-level calorie-rich ice cream, I would like it a lot. And if I wasn't trying to hold myself back, eat a lot. If you gave me the same ice cream in which you blended some quinine that made it a little bitter, or you added in some of these exogenous ketones I've been trying to take lately, which are the most horrible tasting things I've ever had, I think I would eat a lot less. On the other hand, if you locked me in a room where those were my only sources of calories, I think I'd eat a lot less still the first day. Mm-hmm. But if you came back 60 days later, it's hard to know. I think these are some more of the important questions. We do compensate. But I think in general, the idea that what you eat at time A might affect what and how much you eat at time B, or how much energy you expend at time B, to me is wholly uncontroversial. And everybody who says It's not just calories in, it's calories out, and I'm Galileo and everyone's trying to suppress me and I've got a new theory. Get over yourself. You're not Galileo. Sorry.
Charlie actually calls herself Galileo sometimes.
Yeah, all the time. It's my nickname. So with nutrition, a lot of this ultimately comes back to energy intake, but that can look quite different from person to person. I think if I'm remembering rightly, it's more, we hear this general figure around 2,000 calories for women and 2,500 for men. But in reality, it's a very broad guideline. How would someone be thinking about what their intake actually needs to be for them, and what are some of the simple ways that they can stay on track day to day without being obsessed about the specific number?
Well, one of the things I think we've observed is that counting one's calories or writing down what you eat leads to weight loss. Whether it's accurate or not, doesn't matter. Just the act of writing it down tunes you into it. And maybe there's also some social element if you're going to show what you've written down to somebody else, and you don't want to be dishonest, but you don't want them to judge you badly by saying, yes, and I ate 3 pints of ice cream. So then maybe you just don't eat 3 pints of ice cream, so you don't have to tell them that. That seems to be helpful. But again, whether people can maintain it for a long period of time, reality or experience says not so much. So I think we need to make a distinction here between what behaviors are effective if you do them versus what messages are effective. So if you do them, eating a ketogenic diet is very effective for weight loss. Eating a very low-fat diet is very effective for weight loss. Certain aspects of time-restricted feeding, just saying I'm going to eat this many calories and no more. If you do those things, they all work. What we know is that most people who make a good faith effort to do those things will not be able to do those things for a long time. Trying doesn't work so well, at least in the long run. So I think what people can do is they can try to find what works for them. That's one thing. They may want to accept that, and this is something I think we need to study a lot more and get a lot less pejorative about, that the idea of losing weight for a while and then accepting that it comes back up and then doing it again later may not be a bad strategy. We talk about it often as though it's very bad. It's not clear to me that it's very bad. Our data in mice show, yeah, it's better if you can get the obese mouse to lose all the weight and keep it off indefinitely. But if you get them to lose all the weight and let them come all the way back up and all the way down and all the way back up, they do about as well as the ones you get halfway down to normal weight from obesity and keep it off. So, I like to think of that as the dental model of obesity treatment. And by that, I mean, you go to the dentist or the dental hygienist, they say, hey, you have this excess weight on your teeth. It's called plaque and tartar and calculus. And so they scrape the plaque and tartar and calculus off. And if they weighed it, they'd say, look, this is how much weight you lost in this episode. And here's a toothbrush and some dental floss. Go home, do your best, come back and see me in 6 months. 6 months later, they go, hey, guess what? You gained all the weight back. All that calculus and tartar and plaque, all back on your teeth. And they scrape it off again. And nobody says, guess what? Dentistry is a failure. Maybe weight is not unlike that. So that's something to think about. Better to be a yo-yo dieter than to be obese all the time. Now, if somebody says to me, okay, that's all great, but you don't know that works. And I've tried losing weight before. I'm a typical adult who struggled with my weight. This is not new. As a statistician, Dr. Allison, what's likely to happen if I try some lifestyle intervention? I said, well, what's likely to happen is you'll lose a little weight for a little while, and then eventually you'll regain it. Not everybody, but on average, right? That's my best prediction. And if somebody said to me, I'd like to live longer and I'd like to have less body fat, and I'm just, a typical person, I'm nothing unusual about me other than that, I'd say, one of the modern obesity drugs, it's your best bet.
Well, let's focus on that then briefly, David. I wanted to ask you some other related questions about nutrition first. You mentioned several forms of restriction there, the ketogenic diet, which is a form of very low carbohydrate diet, low fat nutrition, and also time restriction where someone might contain their consumption of calories within a certain window each day, typically 12 hours or less each day. And to be clear for listeners, some people might struggle with such restriction. they might have contraindications to it. Many people have a history of eating disorders or disordered eating. And so we're not saying that any of these are for everyone. And I was going to ask you about some changes that someone can make to their food environments to maybe facilitate the changes they're trying to make to their nutrition. But since you focused on the pharmaceutical elephant in the room, these new obesity medications, and you spoke about how they, along with bariatric surgery, which from my perspective feels like it's somewhat fallen by the wayside. And I think a lot of people haven't recognized that it's enormously effective and it's actually relatively safe, especially when you consider the potential consequences, repercussions of obesity in the long term. To focus on the pharmaceuticals, let's say that someone is about to start taking semaglutide, commonly known as Ozempic or Wegovy, for obesity or for diabetes. Do you have any advice for that person in terms of things that they should pay attention to in order to minimize potential downsides and maximize the benefits they're going to get from it?
Sure. Everything I'm saying is sort of on average and in general. Obviously, there are differences for individuals. The first is, I think it is best to do this in collaboration with a licensed physician, healthcare provider who's a pro. Myself as a scientist, I have very deep knowledge of some things, but I'm very ignorant of other things that a physician will know. And so you want to be working with a physician who says, you're experiencing that, or you also take that. Don't take this if you take that. So that's one, have a physician. I would say the second one is, again, there may be exceptions, increase the proportion of protein in your diet. Because what's going to happen is you may already not be having quite as much protein as would be optimal. Now you need more protein because you want to preserve lean body mass as you lose weight. We think, though we don't know absolutely, that more protein will be helpful with that. And yet your appetite has gone down, and it may be that your hedonic thresholds have changed, and it's easier to eat a cupcake than a chicken breast now, and your protein intake may actually go down at the very time you need it to go up. So again, you may want some input from a dietitian, or certainly just monitor this yourself. Increase your protein intake as a proportion of calories. Third thing, resistance training. Do some resistance training. And again, if you can get some advice, if you're not experienced already, go to a gym, get a trainer to start you off, but do some resistance training. There are probably many other things one could do, but I think those would be my big ones.
You said there could be a change in your hedonic threshold. What's that?
So one way that scientists have categorized eating is dividing it into so-called homeostatic eating and hedonic eating. Homeostatic eating would be eating purely to meet the needs of your body.
Right.
But that's not the way that we eat. We also eat because food is absolutely delicious, or it can be.
Right.
And that is hedonic eating. You might have noticed, for example, that you can go to a restaurant, have arguably too much to eat for your starter and your main.
Oh.
But then there's still space for dessert.
Your pudding tummy.
Your pudding tummy, exactly. Very nicely put. And so there's a separate construct called sensory specific satiety, the idea being that you might have tapped out your desire for savory foods, but there's still space for something sweet. At one point, ice cream might be more appealing than chicken, and it might cause you to consume more calories than consuming as much chicken breast as you would like. However, there will come a point at which the ice cream is no longer nearly as appealing.
Yes.
Our preferences are dynamic. And if you could only consume ice cream and nothing else, it might not be that you gain weight, because actually you end up feeling kind of sick and horrible.
Palate fatigue.
We did want to ask you about physical activity to support healthy weight loss. And clearly that's really important when someone is taking some of these medications, because they're now very potent. If we look at the first generation versus second generation versus third generation and so on, the rate at which people can lose weight has increased with each successive generation. And it's now at a point where if you're not doing resistance training, you are going to lose fat-free mass quite quickly.
I agree with you that you will lose fat-free mass, including skeletal muscle. Mm-hmm. But I do want to say that I think there has been an enormous overextension of that message beyond what the data show.
Yeah.
So the message I think has come out is that you lose excessive fat-free mass, that what's been shown is that you lose skeletal muscle, that when you regain the weight, you get even fatter, I think, and that the amount of muscle and fat loss is greater with drugs like GLP-1 agonists than with other sources of weight. I don't think any of those things have been demonstrated.
No. Would you say that if someone were to lose weight at the same rate through dietary changes alone versus dietary changes incited by way of using one of these medications, the composition of the weight loss would be much the same? That's my impression.
Yeah. We're not at the point of saying we have rock solid data on that, but that's my impression.
Yeah.
We're going to be having another very interesting and very different conversation. A year or so from now, you're going to be asking me and other people, how has the world changed now that FDA approved anabolic agents that really work and are safe? And lots of people can take a pill with or without their weight loss medication and build a lot of muscle. Mm-hmm. And we're going to have a very interesting conversation.
So in the experience section, this is where we like to hear from our listeners about challenges or questions relating to weight management. So we've had some listeners email in. So the first one, they've said, how do I navigate my body and weight loss during the perimenopause and menopause when hormones are fluctuating? And how do I navigate through the endless conflicting advice online on this subject?
Easy.
Let me take the second half of that question first. I feel like I have a better handle on that, which is A, don't believe everything you hear, no matter who says it. B, the more extreme something says that departs from usual thinking and reality, the more likely it's like to be false or not hold up. The more novel and different it is, the more likely it's there to not hold up. But some things that are novel and different do hold up, right? So every once in a while, an Einstein and a Galileo do come along. But most people who think they're Einstein and Galileo aren't. So stick with the sort of mainstream advice most of the time. Let that be your base of operations, right? Do I think, for example, that every drug the FDA approves is good for me if I need that indication, and every drug they haven't approved is bad for me? No, of course not. But do I think it's a good starting point? Like, if I've got to make a decision reasonably, if it's an FDA drug approved, I'm probably safe. Not FDA approved, maybe I'll stay away from that until more knowledge. The second thing I would say is, to the best of your ability, look to the evidence, right? So people can talk all they want, then you say, show me the data. And I have a certain set of rules when people talk about interventions. First question, somebody's saying this diet or this drug or this nutrient does this or that. So, okay, is there a study? If there is, let's keep talking. Not, game over. Next question, if there is a study, was it in humans? Okay, if yes, let's keep talking. If no, we're in conjecture land. If it's in humans, was it a randomized trial? No, game over. Okay, now we're in association land. Okay, you've got a randomized trial. Was it long enough? Did it measure the thing I was interested in, right? If you're making a claim about body fat, did you actually measure body fat, or did you just measure my appetite 30 minutes later? Was it long enough? Was it the dose I'm going to take? Am I going to realistically take a half a cup of blueberries, but you did a study that would be the equivalent of 10 cups of blueberries? Right? All those questions, you start to ask those, and you make decisions about what's reasonable. And then we all have to make decisions with leaps of faith. Say, I don't know this with absolute certainty, but I'm willing to accept, this level of certainty. Now, in terms of the perimenopause, I have to say I'm not an expert on that. I think better to consult with other people who are more experts on hormonal changes among women around menopause than me.
The next question we have, they've asked,
I've been using Monjaro and have lost weight, but I have also had some hair loss. But I have been trying to make sure I'm having lots of vitamins and making sure that what I eat is a very balanced diet, including lots of protein and vitamin B12, etc. Why am I still getting hair loss? Because I am making sure that I'm intaking what I need to vitamin-wise.
Answer, I don't know. It could be completely unrelated to the drug or the weight loss, or it could be related to the drug or the weight loss. There are other things that cause hair loss, like age, and yet other factors still. what I would do is I would talk to my physician and say, let's take a look. There are people who measure, do hair counts to say, is this a subjective impression or real? And then have that physician go over all my medications, do all the tests, get an endocrinologist to be working with you.
David, there was so much that we wanted to ask you today, and we've got through a small fraction of it, but it was a very interesting conversation. And before you leave, if you could leave our listeners with one key takeaway from this episode, something you'd like them to remember, what would that be?
I would say we should all put aside our prejudices, whether those are social prejudices, like about morality and what people do or don't deserve, or who should or shouldn't be blamed or be responsible for this or that. Our prejudices about natural and unnatural, drug versus diet, all those things, and just say, what is it that we value? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? And what is the evidence on various things that affect the likelihood of those accomplishments? And how does that accord with our values? And so instead of a priori saying, oh, natural is better, or lifestyle is better, or constant weight loss is better, or drugs are bad, or drugs are good, it's just say, okay, what's the probability of success with a drug or a diet or whatever? What's the magnitude of success? What are the side effects? What is the financial cost? And then make rational decisions as though you were talking about anything other than weight and nutrition that we all seem to get emotional about.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Truly my pleasure.
Well, that was an in-depth chat. It was quite in-depth for me. He knows his stuff, doesn't he?
He does, yeah.
So what are your key takeaways from today, Dr. P?
My key takeaway from David's work in general is what he ended with, and that is that we should focus on results. That's what matters. David himself brought up the fact that when it comes to results, when it comes to the magnitude of weight loss or the prevention of weight gain, the reality is that these new medications and bariatric surgery, which we've had for decades, consistently produce substantially greater changes than asking someone to change their nutrition without any such intervention. They're just more potent. And that can be hard for some people to hear, especially if they have a vested interest, say, but that does matter. Alongside that, those medications aren't for everyone. It might be that we get to a point where there is an appropriate medication for everyone, because more and more of these are coming out by the week. But in the meantime, we still need to understand the nutrition, physical activity. We can't just medicate our way to better body composition and better health. But we should be thinking about this objectively and trying to understand which are the biggest levers that we can pull, and if there are levers that are substantially bigger than others and they happen to be medications or surgery, then how can we improve those and how can we make them more accessible to people that really need them as well? Because the reality at the moment is that a lot of these medications are really expensive.
Yeah.
And I don't want to sound like I'm sat on my high horse here or anything like that, but that is a problem. So the question is, how can we get them in the hands of the people that need them most?
You've been listening to The Method, Health in the Real World, a podcast brought to you by Thriver.
If you don't know about Thriver, it's a health tracking platform that helps you see where your health is heading and what to work on, as well as how to do it. They use painless at-home blood testing to look inside your body and see what's going on. Your tests are analysed by accredited labs, and based on the results, which are reviewed by doctors, you get personalised guidance from real people. People use Thriver like a compass, testing every few months to help steer their health to where they'd like it to be. It's a great tool to start feeling more empowered about your health and to get information that you need to make progress, even when life is chaotic.
Thriver also has some great content out there that can help you get to grips with complex health questions, exactly like what we're trying to do on this podcast. And all of that is free to access. So if you want to learn more, head over to thriver.co. That's thriver.co.
And if you want to listen to Charlie sing really, really well, subscribe to the show. Come back every week for more tunes. You won't be disappointed.
Well, unless you beg me to stop, but even then, probably not.
You can find us by email at themethod@thriver.co.
Seriously, we'd love to hear all of your questions and your voice. We love a voice note.
Special thanks to the Thriver team and to Lower Street for helping us bring the show to life. Content direction by Rich Cousins, Hamish Grierson, Tamar Loach, Vishal Shah, and Katie Yockey. Production by our resident yogi, Lise Lavati, as well as Ryan Sutton and Sam Dattapaulin. Sound design by Alex Rose.
We're your hosts, Charlie Edmondson and Greg Potter, and we will see you next time.
Thanks and bye.
I've literally just put cake versus chicken, ? Is one of my notes. So.
Is that like man versus food?
Cake v chicken, ask Greg.
Oh, tough call.